On this episode of Technically Leadership, let's dive into the mailbag. I've had a few messages come across my desk that ended up being about layoffs, and I thought an episode dedicated to that theme would be valuable. As this is a very touchy subject right now in the tech world, I thought a chat between you and me on the topic would better serve, as many leaders don't want to go on record having this conversation right now. I recently changed jobs due to a layoff and got this comment on my post on LinkedIn. I hope you will share insights to your journey and how you prevailed in your leadership podcast. I also received a number of DMs on the topic after that set of announcements, which I won't read publicly. However, a lot of the themes were the same. From people who had never gotten that one-on-one call and asking what it's like, to people who had to make that call for the first time, to people who really got surprised by this one in this market. I've tried to answer what I can, but we'll go through some of it today. Let's get to it. First things first, though. Before I open this metaphorical mailbag, if you got laid off or are getting laid off, remember that these events usually have nothing to do with you personally. At most large companies in and outside of tech, these decisions get made based on numbers on a spreadsheet and rarely have a thing to do with your personal performance. It may be related to the performance of your business unit, but never you personally, unless you're solely responsible for that output. The people making the decision may be focused on what skill sets they need to move the company forward out of whatever situation is triggering the layoff. And you may just not have gotten lucky this time. Maybe your boss had to really make a very hard decision, and they did the best they could. Don't take this to heart. It's painful. It's scary. But remember that you're a lot more than the job you have. It does not have to do with you. First question. Someone asked, "What's the call like?" I'll be honest, these calls are usually heavily scripted. It's probably going to feel very impersonal. And scripts like this are used to ensure that the company is protected from lawsuits and all information that the employee needs is present in the conversation at the time that they need it. If you're a leader making these calls for the first time, use the script. Sure, I know it feels super awkward, but the script is designed to help you through it. Also, depending on the company, HR may be the one to go through that script on the call, leaving you sitting there just listening, or they may offer to coach you through your first one. This is a difficult part of people management in any industry, not just tech. And unfortunately, this is how business is. It's going to be awkward. It's going to be uncomfortable. If you're a manager that's doing this for the first time and HR has offered to coach you, don't be afraid to accept that offer. That's why it's there. While you want to protect your people, this is a situation where you can't do much more to help. And the best thing you can do is ensure that they have all of the information that they need that you are allowed to give as a representative of the company. Someone else asked, "How can you know one's coming? How would I know if I'm on the list for the next one?" This one's super hard. I will admit that sometimes I've been caught off guard and it happens. Usually, though, you can start to see red flags if you're paying attention that could signal a layoff is imminent. Usually, there's something that can tip you off to at least pay attention. But again, don't really feel bad if you missed it, if you missed the flag. But since we asked, how do we know one is coming? How do we know if we're on the list? We won't know for sure if we're on the list. But you can kind of get some sense. So let's talk about that. Sometimes some people I know typically skip or only half listen to those quarterly calls with company management or sales teams, especially if you have access to those. Stop doing that. Stop skipping those. Most of the times I've been correct that a layoff was coming, the initial signals start to show up at those quarterly calls. You can get a sense of the business ebb and flow if you attend and listen. So you might start to find patterns, just like you might find patterns in the logs that you're reading to try to figure out what happened to a system. This is the same idea. These are people systems that we're working with. And so you can start to think, okay, if I'm troubleshooting a system, what am I looking for? Patterns. And those patterns start to show up here. When the company deviates from those patterns, let's say that you're listening to a call and there were lower than expected earnings in a quarter where there's always been an uptick in past years. It helps to know that that was there because you start to see that deviation and you should explore other indicators to get a sense of where the business is. Maybe as you look through, you'll realize that, oh, well, we just did something. Let's just say you should know about this, but let's say that a division split off into another company. So they sold something that they bought. So, yes, sometimes those numbers might not quite match up right there in that quarter. That's a larger situation that you probably should have known. But if everything's kind of been just going along and you're listening and you start to notice something sounds off, the company is not having the same patterns, you're not getting the same signals, something might not be right. I will say, in my experience, the tech industry has a layoff season in the beginning of the calendar year, which I'll tell you that it's not the same in other industries. Depending on which industry you're in, sometimes you see a stronger signal at the beginning of the calendar year, sometimes you see less of one. The tech industry seems to have one right around December, January, February, usually, if they're going to have one. It's especially important then to pay attention to what company leadership is saying and not saying in those calls right around Q3, Q4, into Q1, because you'll start to see there's something going on. Now, obviously, there's other patterns, like maybe your company is changing strategy. Maybe your company is starting to move in a different direction. A lot of times when you hear strategy changes coming, there's sometimes talk of layoffs. I'll be honest, it's not always a one-to-one correlation that there will be a layoff or there will be a large layoff when a strategy changes, but it does happen. And you definitely want to be thinking about that. Now, some people might say, oh, the flag is my team no longer has a backlog. My team's backlog is shrinking. Personally, I haven't really found value in getting nervous if my team's backlog is getting smaller without any new tasks coming in. First things first, as a manager, I know there's many reasons we might not be getting tasks in for the team to do. You probably know maybe there's product changes coming down the line, projects that are finishing, projects held up for some other reason like procurement. Now, this may seem obvious when I'm talking about this out loud here, but I know when people start looking for flags, sometimes you find problems, whether they're actually there or not. So don't immediately take one flag, one thing like, oh, my backlog is smaller, as, oh no, this is a major problem. Look for many flags as you're trying to figure this out. As an individual contributor, once you're at the point where you're a technical leader, you probably spend only maybe 20% or so of your time working out of a backlog that you have no control over. The other 80% of your time is spent helping to build that backlog for others or raising your head above the work to explore what else needs to be defined to get done. I think Martin did a very good job of explaining this in our very first episode. If my team's backlog is getting smaller, maybe I need to go out and start defining additional problem spaces to scope out. Maybe the team has just been so busy that there hasn't been time to think about those things. Or maybe there's some other cultural problem. You probably already know about this. So if you start panicking over this and you need to think back and go, do I already know this is a problem? Just because you're in the space of, oh no, is a layoff coming? Think about that first and try to calm down and think about it a little bit logically if you can. However, caveat here, If you are used to thinking ahead and planning out future quarters at a specific time of year, and then your manager tells you to focus on something current and current things only, I'd probably start reading any management updates carefully and thinking about what's going on at a macroeconomic level for the company. What do I mean by that? Again, maybe your company just had a big change and there's changing strategy. Maybe there is a competitor that showed up that did better than they did. Maybe there is something bigger going on in the world, as we all know happens. Your management might not be sure yet where everything is going to land. And yeah, it could be a sign that a list is being made if you're told not to think so far ahead. I doubt it though, but it's possible. Overall, as we've mentioned before on this podcast, as a leader, you're already thinking ahead. You're already trying to pay attention to these things. I'm trying to remind you that sometimes the pattern is there, but look for many patterns, not just one. I admit that a lot of my awareness of what's going on when it comes to these flags is watching for overall patterns, following up on odd conversations, and making connections within the company outside of my organization. To be well aware and informed, you want to pay close attention and get perspectives from people outside of your division, whether that's someone in marketing, someone in sales, especially sales. If you start making those connections outside of your engineering sphere with some of the people in business, whether it's joining an ERG, an employee resource group, and kind of talking with those people, paying attention to the meetings that I mentioned before, getting those perspectives from people outside of your division helps avoid the scenario where you're finding red flags that aren't there. But it also gives you an awareness of other things that might be happening in the company. And usually it's through those connections that I've been able to figure out that something's up and I can start watching and listening for something going on. Sometimes it's a gut feeling, I admit, and my gut feeling isn't always correct. So again, it's just something to be aware of. Now, I don't have a direct question on this one because everybody's questions were all different, but I've had a number of folks asking me about landing after a layoff. This one's a hard one, especially right now. In general, I do think that the advice applies that even when you're employed, it's worth dipping a toe in the job market once every 6 months or so. Whether that's a casual conversation with a manager that you know is hunting for an employee, they're recruiting, or it's going through and just sending your resume out and seeing what happens. Doing so helps keep your interview skills sharp and your resume up to date. And that means that should you get caught off guard by a layoff, you're not starting at square one. You at least know your resume has been updated within the past year, because maybe you're not doing every 6 months, and you aren't fighting imposter syndrome as much in the interview process. That was one of the things that really helped me, was knowing that I already had an updated resume because I keep it up to date when I can. And I already had done some interviews, not seriously, but seriously enough. And so when I needed to start doing it again, it didn't feel as awkward. It didn't feel like I was remembering how to do it on the first few interviews I had to do. Sometimes those casual conversations you may have with a potential employer pay off a year down the road when you're hunting, and timing just happens to work out. The current tech employment market, though, is rough. It's hard to even get on the radar of a company as an applicant to even get a screening call, especially with more tooling being used to screen applications long before a human touches it. I honestly don't have a great answer here, other than the standard advice that networking and connections are how to find the next role. That's how you get past the tooling that's there and you get in front of a human being. I do have advice, though, from the writing world about dealing with hunting right now in this market. Don't count your rejections. One of the really common things that writers will do as they're sending out books, book manuscripts and things like that, at least they used to many eons ago when I knew about this, was that they would send them out, and some people would take all that stack of rejection letters when they were still mailing physical rejection letters. You can see some dating here. And they would put them on the wall. There's a famous story, I think it is uh, Stephen King putting them on a nail in his office. But I find that it's not helpful. It hurts to get a rejection, whether it's your first rejection or your 100th rejection or your 1,000th rejection. Just as we would do with CFPs or call for papers, call for proposals for conferences, you don't count those because it always hurts, especially if you've never had the chance to make a case for yourself to a human being, if all you had was your resume. Some people keep a running tally, and I find that when you're looking at those numbers, it can be really hard to feel that there's a chance. Without that hope, it's hard to keep sending out resumes, to keep networking, to keep going to meetups or to conferences or wherever you go to find those connections. And it's extremely hard to then go into an interview when you do get one without unconsciously signaling that lack of hope. While I'd love to believe that interviewers understand how hard it is, that every single one has this really strong empathy for you, I have to be realistic here. Unfortunately, I know many interviewers don't have that empathy and they can't remember, or maybe they just can't understand that feeling of going through the 100th interview that day, the phone calls and everything, and this is just another one, and not believing you have that chance. So I'm really serious when I say don't count your rejections. It's not worth opening up that black hole. Finally, I guess a word to managers. If you are going through that interview process, obviously understand that it's really hard. And I know many managers right now are getting flooded with applications. It's worth going through each one if you can. Sometimes it's really obvious this is not a good fit, but it's worth remembering that people are coming to these interviews with a lot of other interviews, probably that they've already been at, and they might be tired. So keep that in mind. But if your team goes through a layoff, it's hard to be the ones left behind. Not only are you likely doing more work, but you also wonder if you're next, if there's going to be another one. So be empathetic with your employees after a layoff, as morale is going to be low. People are probably going to want to talk about it. They're going to want to get the anxiety out and figure out why and what happened. Obviously, you can't answer things. There's only so much you're allowed to do from HR's perspective. And if there's questions that you're not sure you can answer, go ahead, reach out to HR. But consider that if you're measuring some kind of tickets closed output or some kind of output like that, which we can talk about metrics later, productivity is likely going to drop after a layoff. You may need to push back on your management if they're asking why. It's going to be hard on you too, to be able to be stuck in the middle like that. So I usually say to work with the flow by finding out what's driving the push from your management and find a way to meet that underlying need while shielding your team while they're adjusting for whatever they need to adjust to. Overall, as a leader, you probably have a desire to protect your team or to give a boost to people around you. I want to remind you that no matter where you are in this, you need to take care of yourself first before you can help others. So, if you are dealing with layoffs, either as someone who's been laid off, someone who had to give the news, or someone who survived the round. Take a minute and acknowledge what's going on for you. Acknowledge that that happened. When you get off that call, if you need a minute, take it. Don't be ashamed, because it is a hard thing. This is a hard thing for all of us. Take care of yourself. Once you've taken care of yourself, you have the mental space to help others, whether that's going back to your team and explaining what happened, going through and trying to take care of your family, going through and trying to help a coworker who got laid off, trying to find a place for them to land. Take care of yourself first. Understand that it happened. And then hopefully we can help each other get out of this. That was our mailbag episode, and it was a difficult topic to cover. I hope it helped. If you have thoughts or feedback on this episode, or in general, I would love to hear them. You can find me on LinkedIn, Blue Sky, or Mastodon, or you can reach out to me through the Pack Up Pushers follow-up form, all of which are linked in the show notes. If you're a leader and want to come on the podcast with me to talk about technical leadership, reach out to me. I'd love to have a conversation. Otherwise, we'll chat in a couple weeks. Go lead.